Docking request accepted.
Good morning, New Eden! Today is July 27th, 2025, and this is the Federation Frontline Report. I'm your host, Frozen Fallout. My co-host is Nightflyer.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning into the show. It has been an up and down week in the war zone, but mostly up. And we had a great time on Friday night. So thank you for hosting that fleet. Started off a little slow, but we covered a lot of ground.
You mean
we
Wednesday
get some
night?
good fight. Yeah, Wednesday night.
Wednesday night.
What did I say?
You said Friday. Just making sure.
Friday that was a totally different thing. But but there was a little controversy there that we ruffled some feathers, and someone brought something out that was a little too blingy for our fleet, and got upset when we weren't going to go reship into blingier stuff to help them.
Yeah,
so
that was also reshipping in that situation was like 5 minutes out,
yeah,
to a certain degree.
So,
there was a minimum. There was some room there in the very beginning. I think there was definitely room for improvement for sure. But hey Canuck, thank you so much for subscribing. Of course, the Amar victory, the Amar coming over to check out the news, the proper news, the only news, the news for you and I. And we're going to be talking about EVE. History of a virtual universe, EVE Online. So this is going to be something similar to we're going to talk about it on here, and then I'm going to go do a seminar at Gen Con about this. So my seminar is going to be a little bit different, but it'll be definitely we're going to be talking, I think, on the show. And I think one thing that we might want to do at one point is maybe just go through a lot of like the history of what makes up EVE, and we should also do a show on trying to gather as much information on the history of faction warfare.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure.
Which is less documented, very much so less documented. All the old terms are gone.
Yeah, we don't. I think the thing that makes it the exciting news is all the really big battles, the 1DQ. Stations blowing up and that kind of thing, which I get it. It's exciting. There's a lot of people involved. But I think we have a lot of smaller skirmishes in faction warfare that, are just as impactful to this game. So I know we've been a part of a couple of them lately where, some of the bigger ships have dropped.
Yeah, we're part of a great economy for EVE. It's like this is the forever never war that just is. There's no reason for it. There's no winning this war. I've seen multiple groups come in and been like, I want to win faction warfare, and it's like, what do you mean? Like, it's gonna be back and forth no matter what. There's no kicking the other. It just, you get tired after a while of taking systems, holding systems, fighting, and you get worn down, and eventually, it can kind of stay at like a 50-50, especially the new frontline system where it is a much slower kind of pushing back and forth, and it's not such a huge wave usually, although there have been some really strong pushes by the Caldari, but in general, it's frontlines kind of make it's a reshipping kind of thing, like being able to control those areas, having to move out farther away from your control zones, the logistics, which is one of the big things that's really important about EVE, is that this is a single shard universe. It's, there's logistics involved in this game like none other, and there's destruction in this game that's, like, shipping stuff is extremely expensive. getting stuff to front lines, moving stuff to where people live, is one of the reasons why, no matter what, it's very hard to not create one place like Jeddah. And Jeddah just, exists because of the geography of eventually what became, and is kind of a natural kind of area for people to where it was. And then now that there's already that spot, even though that there's probably better spots now geographically, like there's just so much money and shit in Jeddah right now and just the name, the recognition there is never going to go away. Jeddah is never going to not be a trade hub, like the trade hub, basically.
Yeah, that was one of the discussions I had with CCP Overload when we were in Iceland too, as far as some of the unbalanced here in the war zone, and we talked about the LP and stuff, but I'm like, it's kind of the unfair advantage of them having Jeddah, and he's like, yeah, but that's like player made. CCP didn't say, hey, let's move this trade hub from, like, what was it, like Intaki or something at one point, or
no, Yuri or something like
that. Yeah, but. And then it moved. It got, the players moved it. They started their trading over in Jeddah. I don't know who made that decision.
They cut
probably
off.
Matani. Let's blame the Matani on that one.
It was like the super highway that happened that went to Yuri, and they cut that off. And then from there, their 4 trade hubs, kind of were created. 4 or 5 trade hubs. In the end, we're at like 5 trade hubs. But Jeddah has always just been the most powerful. And it was like around, players were going there to do missions and stuff like that. Like this was like it was a station rich area. It had lots of stuff. It was very center to all the other kind of trade hubs. And just worked out to be a really easy short trip all the way. Now the Triglavian event, that is something that CCP is something not a lot of people interacted with per se, but there was a huge devastation felt in HiSec when they took out that, like, the geography changes definitely are some really important things, and the addition of like Titans and jump bridges and the ability to take space and own it and stuff like that. I would say the history of EVE in that regard too has really evolved over the years, and has something that ties in a lot with what we're going to kind of be going over here, because a lot of our focus though is going to be on the player made history of EVE Online, and kind of going all the way back into like at the very beginning of all of this. It was around like 2003, 2004. There's the story of Jade Constantine and Jericho Fraction and stuff like that going up against Evolution, and they ended up trying to like rally a lot of people underneath their banner. And there's like a story about how he talks about, like, there's King Henry II, who basically invokes Arthurian legend on his way home from like putting down a rebellion. Then he's got to go home to put down another rebellion. He's got to go through like Welsh or something like that, and he like gathers up basically a huge army of people that normally would hate him, but because he sent his bannermen ahead and said, and sent bards and stuff like that ahead to go out and do like storytelling about the coming of Arthur, that Arthur has returned, and putting out this like Arthurian legend, he was able to gather up a bunch of people. And so he was kind of like the Jade Constantine would go out there and just put out like massive amount of propaganda. And Evolution, which is like the beginnings of Bob, which is going to become one of the most powerful organizations in EVE Online for many, many years. They started in the beta and just kind of came in, and they focused very strong on learning how to grow, after start with nothing, get rebuilt, because they reset the server a lot. Once the server went live, they no longer reset the server. So we've got a living universe that starts in May of 2003 and goes to present date, and they were able to jumpstart this with an understanding of how to get in and start from nothing and get to something, because they've not only did they it's a little bit different than if they hadn't gone through the reset. So they became this tight-knit group. Also, they became they used espionage, and the idea and the concepts of espionage this early on in the game was not really well heard. A lot of people, there was basically Bushido fighting, where people are you should all just line up at a agreed point spot, and do tournament style combat with each other in order to fight over space and stuff like that. But they came up with the idea that they wanted to be the most powerful group, and the first thing to do was just to seed a bunch of spies everywhere and kind of sit tight, gather information, make moves, and one of their big beefs was with Taggart Transdimensional, and they were this Ayn Randian type group. So they had this belief that they were just going to be really good at building shit, and they lived with the Venel Alliance. They had more miners than anybody else. They sold stuff at 30% markup in Venel normally, so they were able to make massive amount of gains. And this ended up being something that started off where when I go back, so this is before I was in Eve, and when I go back and I listen to this kind of stuff, and I remember hearing about this stuff to a small degree. Now, this is the stuff that did not make BBC News, but is definitely one of the core foundations of how everything went with the idea of democratic councils for alliances that worked on this concept of multiple people's different interests trying to work together underneath a strong democracy to own large chunks of space started to show its cracks. Because when a military force came in with just the only thing that they're doing is trying to hammer everything, and then they're allowing other people to come in and they'll be, I have a hammer, I'll smash you if you don't just pay me as my vessel, right? So they were basically, they're protected by Bob because Bob won't beat them up, and shown very much throughout history in Eve is that when a player comes in and another large empire comes in and starts invading any of the vessels, the first thing that the empire does is back off and basically pull back. We'll get your lands back later. Come, let it all burn. And that's one of the big things with Eve is that it can burn. You're leaving asset stations out in during this time you couldn't blow up stations, and in order to lay a station, it became an NPC conquerable station, but you were locked out of your assets, which was something that was fairly rare in Eve. At the very beginning, basically if you had it in a station, it was safe, and if you were one of these conquerable stations, that became the lockout. So a lot of people actually would just switch sides, when just the people who were living out of that station would be I'm just going to join whoever conquered me. I'm just, so vessels kind of would switch and just change names and stuff like that. But yeah, so I do have to say that there is, how much of a parallel do you think that there is to Earth history in Eve history?
Just trying to. I don't know if I can draw any exact knowledge of specifics, but yeah, you definitely have the, the fractionization. You have like the large alliances. You had like the Roman allegiances that eventually took over, all of Europe, all the way up to, Ireland, out towards India. I mean, they had a large swath of most of the known world population outside of Asia at that time. So, yeah, I mean, once you got kind of that foothold, but even then, they someone that big and that powerful, how could they ever possibly fail? And then, eventually they do. And I think we've seen that kind of repeated in Eve over its history too. You have these large groups that they may have a third of all known space, and yet at some point they're going to fall apart.
I do think that especially in the beginning, I think that was a very, like, there was a lot of volatility in the beginning of the history of Eve. And I think actually that's where I think one of the parallel kind of comes in, is that there's, in the beginning of our like civilizations being built, it was very chaotic. There was lots of battles and wars that are kind of going on. But one thing I've kind of noticed is that as of late, like, Goonswarm has been around since the beginning, basically. Like, they were 2006 or something like that. They're like the child of these of that time and era, but it's now like the ancient empire that still owns a large swath of space. The Imperium has been around for an extreme, like, there's been big fights that have brought them all the way down to not owning massive amounts of space, and people have shifted where they lived to a certain degree. But I feel like we've come to one of the most stable periods in EVE Online as of late, where right now we don't have there's no impending war that anybody's gonna have with Pandemic Horde. Like, that war just happened, and they took some of their vessel states basically and pushed them back to one spot. But Pandemic Horde's gonna live forever. So PamFam's alive. Winterco is, always going to be alive. One second here.
I've only been playing for 5 years, and I came in just prior. So it was during COVID. So it was 2020. So it's just prior to the Second B War. So World War B, Vietnam. I'm not sure what label they actually puts on it. Who gets to choose that? But I'm gonna call it the Second Great War. So I wasn't here for the first one. So, but that's kind of what I knew, and it was interesting to kind of see that as a brand new player, like, still trying to figure my crap out. I mean, all my stuff was still in like one station, and that was my mentality. My world was very small in comparison to what these big alliances were doing. And for me, it was just kind of awe-inspiring. Like, man, maybe I could get to that point someday where I'm part of one of these alliances and flying the big ships and being part of these big battles with all the tie-dye and stuff.
Yeah, no, it's.
But it was.
It
was interesting to see those kind of moving around the map, and Jin Tan doing his weekly news reports and things like that. I thought was really cool.
Yeah, I do feel like there is kind of a downward trend on, like, the massive reporting of, like, the war that's, like, the wars that are happening in 0.0 at this time. There just doesn't seem to be, like, we're getting more news, I feel like, on FlowSec as of late, with, like, all the fighting that's just been going on just randomly with Dread battles and stuff like that happening. And faction warfare in Amar space and in Galente space, and things have, but I think that kind of mirrors a lot, because you like mentioned that, like, there's a world war, or
the Great War,
the Great War 2, So actually, that would be like Great War like 5 or something like that, because like Great War 1 goes all the way back to like when Bob basically. So after there was like a breaking off with the Dan Ranian people basically said, listen, I'm going to like not work with all of you guys anymore because we're really big and we're a bunch of miners and we're super rich, so fuck you. And basically told the role players to go get fucked and lost like their a large chunk of military and friendly forces by doing that. Caused like a whole like schism war up there, and Evo kind of I think got out of there at some point and was just happy that everything went to hell basically. And I think worked with even them to, there was like Phoenix Coalition got created, and in the end there Bob basically formed out of this, which is Band of Brothers, that actually was CCCP. So they were 3 C's in a P, and they were trying to say like cookies, cake, and something else, please, basically is their so it's this so the CCP told them like that it looks too much like CCP, so they ended up taking this Band of Brothers alliance logo, and they went off with this idea that they are the elite alliance, like that they are the best of the best, the people that are going to be military first and war first, that we're gonna conquer through might. And the interesting thing is that not too long after they started doing that did they say, well, we also need to become builders. Because once moon mining became like a huge thing inside of the game and owning space, and being able to have control of space through starbase allocation out there, and all of the riches that came with moon mining, there was basically, because it was completely passive back in the day. Like you just plop down a thing and you just get a bunch of really good moon goo that would just pour out of this thing, which is basically just liquid ISK, that can make some of the best items in the game. And so Bob was able to, at first go around and beat everybody with a hammer, and then kind of gather up just the most elite industrial people as well that wanted to build, and they just lived out of Delve for a long time. And that's where like the beginning of this like Bob versus the rest of the game. And so the North at that time was more of a coalition of different kind of like traders and miners and builders and stuff like that, and that they were big enough with their numbers that they didn't have to worry too much about what was going to be a big problem in owning the space that they had. But they weren't very good at fighting. Like one of their main tactics was just overloading the server. And this is when it started to get, I believe, to be where people started reporting on the news about Eve. And you started hearing these 1,000, well, I think at the beginning it was like 300 man was, I don't know if 300 man ever made the news, but around this time it would have been like 300 man versus 300, or 250 people. And this is at a time when, not very many people are playing in bigger than 16 versus 16, 15 man matches. And this is like 3 hour, 4 hour, 5 hour slog fests that can be going on. And this is before tie-dye as well, where the server would just break, you know, and like shit would just go like completely nuts. There were, you know, there was nano dummies that were flying around. You know, depending on what time in era, you know, it was like there was kestrels that had giant missiles bigger than the ship itself on it, and could be used to, like, you know, just one shot other ships, you know, and so just everybody's flying around. Hey, AFK, how's it going? So he's AFK says Eve hasn't had a generational shift reset in the game like real life because the demographic, new player, new members, hunger and drive. Eve current civilization structure is being stretched out through time. How do you make immortals constantly interested? Max damage campaign. Yeah, no, well, so max damage campaign was a little bit, that would be after where we're kind of at this point. But yeah, that was a huge kind of thing with when your people don't have anybody necessarily to go fight or any reason to go fight, you're just gonna go do it just to say that we're getting revenge and just to make sure you're entertaining people. And a lot of Eve is about entertaining. It's interesting because there is, I think there is a lot of parallels to Eve in real life, and I think that Eve is real in a certain sense that it's a digital universe that is very self-contained. You know, there's not multiple mirrors of it. We're not going to talk about China and how they had to force to get their own mirror. So we do have a mirror universe of Eve, and it's dark. It's crazy. They're even more insane with like hyper inflation in money, and RMT, as far as I understand, is extremely insane over there. But Eve in general has had to balance the idea of fun per hour and money per hour. And money per hour is a really hard driver inside of this game. It's how I think a lot of average people kind of play this game. It's the first thing that you get into is like, how much money can I make per hour by doing something? And I would say that is something that's very different on an Empire level. Because on an Empire level, you want to do content, you want to create content, and if you're flowing in and having unbelievable amounts of money, you can just throw out content sometimes. If you have a reduction to the amount of resources and everybody goes, you know, into a frenzy about I can't afford to have a Titan now. We can't afford to lose Titans, and you're not going to see them being used. If the amount of work that it takes to create something's fun per hour is not there, for the most part, you're not going to be able to gather up enough people to do something. You can do something like, I feel like there are people who do the like ISK per hour just to make ISK per hour that are part of different kind of activities inside of this game that just do hardcore into that. But there is a lot of reasoning behind and money behind moving into war and fighting. In Eve, it actually, I feel like when you get into scarcity, we're kind of seeing that people just don't want to actually try to fight over stuff like they used to. Everybody fights, nobody quits. But yeah, so at the beginning of Eve, people were really having to fight over resources. And max damage didn't kind of come out, and even when it did come out, it was well, okay, there are some things. Is that Bob was a group that said, I'm going to take over the entire galaxy. Like, they were like an existential threat to everybody, basically, at their origin story. It smells like treachery on reason. Well, yes, treachery on resources. But so going back to Bob, I'm always going to be biased in this regard because I fought Bob. So I was in the Interstellar Alcoholic Conglomerate. Woo! So we fought McFix, which was, you know, this these basically the Mercenary Coalition, which is like one of the most well-known mercenary organizations that owned their own space, had their own name on the map, and, you know, had a base of operations at like the bottom of the map, you know, like farthest away from everybody, and they were harbingers of Bob, basically. Goons aren't saints in Bob's demise in empire building. Hello, lads. I would say, yeah, no, Goons definitely. It's interesting the way that they took out Bob was very not empire building. Like, it was outside most game mechanics in order to achieve victory over Bob. And for a long time, like, Bob did get beat back to where they were just in Delve for a long time, and they were able to expand out and you know, fight back, and, you know, they would it was really hard in Eve for people to take somebody's space permanently, because you had to live there. And that was one of the big things in all of Eve, basically, is you had to be able to power project out to that far. And as far, you know, you had to have people using that space enough to care about actually controlling that space. Which is why vessels have always been very dangerous inside of being a vessel. Is you're paying for your overlord not to beat you up. It's basically a cartel. You know, because as soon as another gangster rolls in and starts, like, deciding that you're their turf and they're gonna give it over to Bobby over here, you're just gonna that's what's gonna happen. And unless there's, you know, bigger fights going on, you know, like, yeah, they might be fighting over your space, but they're also very likely to be like, I'm just not going to, you know, defend this, and we'll pull back. It will shore up our logistics lines and stretch out the enemy's logistics, and force them to have to put in vessels or live there directly, which is something that I always found very interesting in Eve, is the pure, like, logistical aspect of it all. But when it comes down to it, the way that Bob did get defeated was through, I wouldn't call it spy work, a defector, basically. Kind of going to, and it's one of the most interesting stories in Eve, is that there was a guy who had, like, director access in the Executor Corp for Bob, and he was doing mining for Goons. And the dude's like, oh, we did, like, a background check on you eventually. Like, they were gonna scam him at first, but then he was, like, such an interesting person and wanted to just do, like, mining and relaxing. He was, like, basically, like, all about the industry aspect of the game and the mining aspect of the game. And they were like, okay, cool, well, you know, we've kind of been checking on things, and you seem to be, like, a Bob spy. And so by, like, uncovering him, he's like, oh, well, not really. Like, I really just don't want to be part of Bob anymore, but I am a, like, director. and they're like, oh wait, oh okay, what does that mean? Like, what is like what like what can we do with this? So they like looked at the game mechanics, and they basically just pressed a button, and they disbanded the entire alliance. Like, and they, he took all the stuff out of all the corp hanger, all the caches that they could have. All the stations at this time are destroyable, and so they're just immediately go to nobody owning. Like, anybody's up for grabs. You can, like, if I believe at that time, if you like shot the station enough, you got like ownership of the station in a neutral zone type thing until somebody actually got control of the system. So at this point in time, all hell breaks loose, right? So like, they had upgraded the game to make it so that you could become really defensive. Basically, if you had like the highest level of protection, you couldn't take the core systems of somebody. But with this little workaround, ooh, excuse me. Went down the wrong tube. But yeah, so basically at this point in time, when they kind of fall apart, it's completely unexpected, but everybody just kind of jumps on it, takes them over, and the best part is when Goonswarm takes over. They have basically the same thing that happens to them, except it was Cartoon, the like actual leader of Goonswarm, who comes in and does about the same thing after a long, like, basically there was a long time of peace and nothing being shaken up or anything like that. A lot of divergence on what people believed needed to be, where to allocate resources. And it was a fun versus, like, shore up the defenses, go to war with other people, or, make sure that we have, like, the best war engine to, like, can we just fuck with people in high sec and, just do, other kind of activities and stuff. So there's a huge, like, debate about this stuff kind of going on, and the leader that ended up taking control of stuff, because there was a whole thing where Mintani ended up basically going after CCP and trying to, like, say that they were, biased towards Bob, and advocating, like, that there was a bunch of cheating that was going on. Now, this was after, like, the T2 scandal, which did prove that Bob had, like, a developer that cheated for them. But basically a bunch of that backfired, and he ended up having to step down from CEO and just going back to doing Black Ops work after that. And so I believe that some stuff kind of happened. Eventually, Cartoon got a hold of it, and he was like, I'm just going to disband the whole alliance. But the funny thing is we'll never know, just like true history, we'll never know exactly what happened here, because there's a lot of, like, belief that he just was completely incompetent and didn't know, and let all the sovereignty bills went up, and he didn't pay for anything. There was, what was it? It was something along the lines of, there was some scandal that happened regarding that. Shit, I have to look that back up. I'll have to dig into that more. Anyways, yeah, so Goons basically have a guy who just comes in and just dismantles everything. And that's one of the really big like kind of turning points of the game again. And goons have to go live up in Declan. They have to deal with the Tau Ceti Federation and this like whole diplomatic system of like everybody gets like a vote. There's you've got to kind of work with, you know, a lot of different organizations and piece together, you know, in order to make a decision you have to go through many layers of bureaucracy in order to make a choice on what you're going to do next. I know the next major scandal after Bob's downfall was the Casino Wars in 2016. I was around when that all went down with CO2. Oh yeah, so the Casino Wars were really crazy because that was lots of scandals. There's a lot of I wonder which scandal you're talking about with that though. But I know that like so CO2 backstabbing goons during that time. There was a bunch of real-time money trade that was happening inside of casinos, which was like that's another kind of like Eve is real. There had to be like eventually Eve was so real that they were like, oh dude, we can't allow gambling like in our game anymore. I love doing a ton of Texas Hold'em back in the day. One of my favorite pastimes is to do Texas Hold'em and do ISK for it because it didn't feel like it was real money. I didn't like it was kind of play money, but it was kind of, you know, it's virtual play money that actually can buy spaceships and stuff. So I didn't, you know, it, but it definitely, I could see how these casinos were making insane amount of ISK. It was very predatory, and also there was just a huge money laundering system. I could put you under the table on Hold'em if it ever happened. Oh yeah, no, I'm totally down to give that a shot. But yeah, that is a whole different ball game, way ahead of time, because that is, let's see here, I believe that 2000, let's see, Casino Wars were, that would be like 2016. So let's take a look here real quick. Got ahead of myself here because there are some things that I did want to bring up as well before we got to the disbanding of Bob and then the disbanding of Bob disbanded in I didn't have a thing for that. I have to make sure I get some timelines on this a little better. But anyways, so it would have been 2010 or so. Let's see. Let me double check that. (2009) February 2009. So yeah, after Bob got disbanded, so one of the things that's really cool, and I highly suggest people kind of checking out, is like the EVE Online Alliance map 2007 to 2025, and I'll post that on here. And so this is one of the things that just gets kind of interesting because right around this time, so around 2007 is when we actually started getting these Venal maps. And these are super cool. And so let me Let me see here. I can bring this over here. Alright, so these are super cool. It kind of shows you. So this is when Goonswarm was so 2009 November. Goonswarm, you know, holding everything down here. This is all where Bob used to own everything. You can see here 2008 Bob basically owning everything down here. And these maps are just one of the coolest just like hugely helpful to kind of just see the actual history of Eve. This is the reason why there are maps for faction warfare, but once again, it's like a kind of a forever war, so it doesn't change. You know, like you don't see the new names pop up of what corporations were part of the faction warfare that kind of owned a system. You know what would be interesting actually? If they made it so that you could, if you were part of faction warfare, you could start owning space to a certain degree in faction warfare. So we could make like a history like this. We already have that with, if you want to get out. I do, one thing I have always thought about doing is faction warfare. There's one system here. I'll actually show you. Let me take this. Let me take us down. Take this down, and we'll take, just because this is how real Eve is to me, is that I want to get on that map to a certain degree at some point in time. And this is when we have like hundreds of members, because you know, Federation Frontline Report, at some point we're gonna have so many reporters that are gonna want to be Clark Kent Superman. You know, it's like, because we're reporters, but really we like bust off the jacket and then pull out a machine gun and start mowing people down like Deadpool. But we're, you know, also like Clark Kent, and we report on it and make sure that it looks really good for us when we do it. You were passing the checkpoint and you didn't pass any regulation shots. Because Eve is a really, really evil, crazy, dark universe. But let me see here. Let me pull this up.
More like Jimmy Olsen.
And then I'm gonna go here. Okay, so I believe it's right here. Yes, Elsa Voinen to F-TAC or FC or F7 C-TAC H. It allows for you to own. You could own one system. Maybe, or even just that little constellation. I wouldn't want to own too much, actually, because as soon as you get too much space, you have like too many problems. Like the only reason why I want it is to have like my name on the map. It'd be basically impossible to do it with less than a substantial force that would make people okay with it. I mean, it's one system, so I don't know. We could maybe do it. We could do it. I think we can do it. We just need to get more people. But Elsa Voinen will always be under Gallente control. It's low sec, it's part of faction warfare, and it kind of makes like sense that, you know, at the Gallente, I think we should own. So now we just need to take over Haid. Once we've taken over Haid completely, and then we can take over Elsa Voinen, and then when we've taken over Elsa Voinen, then we can take but actually, the one thing that I've always heard, and I've seen this happen, is that people that live out in 0.0 don't want to do too much and have other problems to deal with and other things to do besides faction warfare. Which is why we don't see a huge influence, even though we see them on the kill boards. We don't see a huge impact, at least in Gallente faction warfare, from the 0.0 groups. But what do you think about that? Should we take 0.0 space? get our names in the books.
I don't know if that helps the faction warfare aspect anyway.
It probably won't. It can be our
Yeah.
failed experiment, though. So
Yeah. Well, I'm sure someday I will be tired of faction warfare, and I've thought about that as far as what would be next. What would be the next thing to do? And yeah, it would probably be moving
Well, the
out.
thing that's nice about faction warfare is it's always going to be there, and now with enlistment, you can kind of. That's one of the things that I'm really surprised at is how enlistment hasn't like greatly hurt the faction warfare corporations, and I think it kind of comes down
Mhm.
to the idea of what you were also talking about too, is that you want to do something else other than faction warfare, um, and which is why I've never really pushed to be a hardcore corporation of like taking. I mean, I've talked about it. I've had
Mhm.
ambitions to kind of do it, but I've never been too concerned about it. Is because, from my point of view, faction warfare at this point is kind of a retirement area. It's an easy, relaxing. Uh, after 20 years of playing Eve, uh, if I get enough grumpy old men in retirement homes and we want to take space, like that, I'm always gonna rattle the cage for doing something epic. And we've done crazy shit. We do the Madison meetup. We've gone to FanFest twice now as a
Mhm.
corporation. Um, and like we're trying to make our stamp in Eve just as much as like a lot of other people, um, and that's one of the things that just it really is really interesting how cool Eve is with that, though. Like it's the I just can't stress enough how impressed I am, and so we're kind of running out of time here, and so we tried to jam in as much history as we possibly can. We basically got to the fall of
Oh yeah, we're
Goons
gonna
and the fall
we'll have to do a
of
part two.
Bob.
We'll do a part two
Yeah,
next
we
week then.
got part threes and fours. We could definitely do. The interesting thing is that you don't really get maps until 2007. So there's a whole history of um, 2003 to 2004 that there are some maps out there. There's some other maps that I have found and you can kind of piece together, but it's like piecing together I just want to kind of how much this is like history is that you got to go back and you have to piece together a narrative that is one narrative, because I find it interesting. I don't know how many other games, if any, that are massively online RPGs that do one shard. So we've got like the Russians, like we didn't even get into, there's a whole war with the Russians. The Russians take over like half the galaxy. There was at one point that the Russians were on their back foot. Goonswarm meets up and works with the Russians. Russians owned for like a long time, and this is one of the big things is that it is a multiplayer um, world game that like every nationality plays this game. Even the the Great Firewall of China doesn't hold back people from Pam Fam is notoriously known for being multiple of those people have come over from the Serenity server, which is a whole other thing about you know I do love how there's a mirror universe. Um, but there is a time period where it's less documented and it's harder to get information. And it's actually interesting how now things have kind of gotten to a point where things are less talked about. I feel like I don't know if it's just me, but it definitely feels like the different media outlets on Eve all taken a hit. Um, and so tell me if I'm wrong. Tell me in the comments if I'm wrong. Um, but
In
I
the
feel
context
like
of EVE Online, Accidental Empire primarily refers to a significant event that occurred in YC 119, roughly 2017 real-time, where an informal coalition of Federal Defense Union (FDU) alliances conquered and settled large parts of Cloud Ring.
It's a lot of text.
Oh yeah, no, he did text to speech. That was really cool. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that is. There is the Fed Up. I believe it's also around that time as well. Which is, I feel like I'm connected to, which is why I feel like I've already hit the books a little bit with this. Is that Fed Up was, X Meta was part of that. They were, central in a lot of the stuff that was going on with it, and I was the founder of X Meta. And so I had a lot of fun, just listening and hearing and reading about what Fed Up was doing during that time. I was actually Goon, so I was really sad that they didn't end up coming over to the Goon side of everything. And the ended up like the other great wars that ended up happening. But yeah, thank you all though so much for watching. I think we'll go ahead and wrap things on up here. We'll do another episode of this later. There's millions more things to talk about, basically about the history of Eve, because it is really deep. One of the things I would like for you to do though, if in the comments or as we're wrapping up here, if you want to like spout out any little thing about your your kind of story in Eve, because one of the things I find really interesting in Eve is that there is your own personal story in Eve is really, it impacts everybody else to a certain degree. Like even the smallest amount of weird, like if you're selling minerals in Jeddah, you might be financing the war engine of different unknown empires or criminal organizations, or because like that's everybody's items are that you create or you destroy or you interact with, anything that you're the injection of ISK into the game that you're doing just by going and ratting has like a direct influence on the entire economic structure of Eve like no other game. And your own personal story can be really interesting. It's you're not special because you are the hero of the day. You're special because your story is different from everybody else's, no matter what. So definitely tell the story. Let us know, what your history is in Eve. And we will continue to do probably a 25-part history of Eve. Extravaganza someday, it's a never ending. It's the infinity part. No,
that's the whole part of the Eve storyline, is that it is continuing. It's
Eve
written
forever.
by us, the players, and will continue. So there you go.
Have a great night.
Good night, everybody.